Number 10. MS-13. The most dangerous gang currently active right now in the United States of America is by far the MS-13. For years now, the violent MS-13 gang, which has its origins in El Salvador, has been terrorizing New York City, Long Island, and the surrounding area. According to the New York Times, federal prosecutors have linked the gang to over 55 murders in just the past 10 years. The gang has perpetrated a wave of violence that has left entire blocks bloody. The MS in MS-13 stands for Mara Salvatrucha, and there are thousands of members of this gang all across the country. Most of the gang members are immigrants from Central America. Just recently in May, 10 men were charged in taking part in 3 murders in Queens, one of them on the platform of a subway, the other out in the open on a sidewalk, and the other near a public park. One of the victims was only 17 years old, beaten and strangled after the MS-13 gang members saw his tattoos and thought he was a member of a rival gang. In the end, he wasn't, and the MS-13 members killed a perfectly innocent person simply because he had the wrong tattoos. Number 9. Bloods and Crips. The Bloods have been around for years, nearly 5 decades to be exact. They formed in 1972 in Los Angeles as a street gang to rival an earlier street gang called the CRIPS. The Bloods can be identified by their members wearing the color red, while the Crips can be identified by the color blue. But have you ever wondered why these two gangs hate each other so much? The rivalry began even before the Bloods were formed as a real group. It started in the 1960s when a gang of Crips attacked 2 students at the Centennial High School in Compton. After the attack, one of the victims formed a new gang dedicated to protecting other people from the violent Crips. But the Crips were unstoppable, beating and killing everyone who got in their way, including other gangs like the Black P. Stones, the Athens Park Boys, and the Pirus. By 1978, a lot of these smaller gangs had formed an alliance and named themselves the Bloods. They then began securing different sections of the neighborhood that the Crips weren't allowed in. Thus began the territory wars. But all these years later, the blood rivalry is still ongoing. Today, the Bloods have at least 15,000 active members in the eastern United States. The gang is heavily involved in the distribution of crack cocaine, and to be honest, that's pretty much their only game. Number 8. Aryan Brotherhood. The Aryan Brotherhood is a savage gang of neo-Nazis that operate both inside and outside of prisons in the United States. There are an estimated 20,000 members of what has been referred to as the oldest and most notorious racist gang anywhere in the country. According to the FBI, the Aryan Brotherhood makes up a significantly small percentage of the prison population, yet is responsible for the most murders. Like most street gangs, the Aryan Brotherhood focuses on drug trafficking, extortion, murdering people for money, and prostituting their fellow inmates for cash. As you most likely already know, the organization is white only. They're the most hardcore racists anywhere in North America. In order to become a member of the Aryan Brotherhood in prison, a new member is typically required to kill another inmate, usually of a different color. The origin of the Aryan Brotherhood isn't something well known. It began in the 1960s at a time when prisons in the U.S. were segregated. When segregation ended and the prison inmates began to be locked up with one another, inmates organized themselves into gangs based on race. The Aryan Brotherhood was the all-white gang, believed to have first been formed in the San Quentin State Prison. Number 7. The YAKUZA. The YAKUZA, the notorious Japanese mafia, has a larger influence in the U.S. than many people think. In fact, the YAKUZA was once so powerful on U.S. soil that during the Obama administration, they had their assets frozen and were banned from conducting any business in the country. The measures were introduced by the U.S. Treasury Department in response to the increasing trouble with the YAKUZA and human trafficking. They also had a pretty hefty hand in money laundering and illegal prostitution. Unlike the violent and disorganized street gangs, the YAKUZA operated primarily like shady businessmen. Through their illicit activities, they brought in billions and billions of dollars a year in earnings. The U.S. couldn't actually stop the YAKUZA from doing business, so instead, they targeted the 2 men at the top of the crime syndicate, Kenichi Shinoda and Kiyoshi Takayama. They froze their American-owned assets and basically banished them from the States. However, considering there are somewhere around 80,000 gangsters in Japan, others will simply take their place in America and keep up business as usual. Have you ever heard of this gang? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. The Mexican Mafia. From what we can figure out, the best estimates place the gang being formed in 1957 by Luis Flores during his incarceration at the Duell Vocational Institution in California. The gang was created to protect Hispanics inside the California prison system, but by 1960 the gang had some serious power. They pushed their influence outside the prisons and began expanding into the public scene, raking in money from gambling, extortion, and the sale of drugs. The Mexican Mafia joined forces with street gangs in East Los Angeles and became an unstoppable force. They had unbelievable influence until the 1990s when police really came down on them and started to pull out the guts of their illegal machine. But in 1995, the FBI had used the RICO Act, the same act used to take down the Italian Mafia, to charge 22 high-profile members. Unfortunately, after the devastating blow to the Mafia's hierarchy, they simply reformed. They're still active today, continuing criminal activities throughout California. They don't wield the same power they used to, but they're definitely still around. Number 5. Barrio Azteca. The Barrio Azteca is one of the most savage and dangerous gangs to ever operate in the state of Texas. Their leader is even on the FBI's list of most wanted criminals. Their members just recently murdered a pregnant U.S. consulate and her husband. But their crimes don't stop at murder. They traffic human beings and drugs, they commit torture, and they're known as professional contract killers. They also operate on both sides of the border, with thousands of members in both Texas and Mexico. They're heavily associated with Mexican drug cartels, as well as 2 other gangs we talked about earlier, the Mexican Mafia and MS-13. But since Barrio Azteca is in bed with the cartels, they also have some cartel enemies. After all, nobody wars with each other quite like the cartels do. If not for their rivalry with the Sinaloa cartel and Jalisco New Generation cartel, Barrio Azteca would be significantly more dangerous. But as it is, most of their killing, drug dealing, and human selling is restricted to Texas, specifically around El Paso. Number 4. The Hells Angels. There's probably no gang in the United States more notorious than the Hells Angels, properly known as the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. But a lot of people don't actually know how the club came into being. It started in 1948 as a club for motorcyclists in California. Specifically, it started in Fontana, and they got their name from the bomber crews in World War II who called themselves the Hells Angels. By 1961, the gang had spread all the way in part of New Zealand. They became infamous by 1965 when the Attorney General of California, Thomas C. Lynch, issued a report on how motorcycle gangs were committing hoodlum activities. For their first few years in the spotlight, the Hells Angels were mostly known as dangerous outlaws. They were notorious barroom fighters, they were exceedingly violent, and the process to become one of the members included initiations that often had to do with committing illegal activities and even beating or killing people. It was the 1970s when law enforcement officials began to realize they were manufacturing and distributing methamphetamine. While the Hells Angels have lost much of their notoriety by now, they still have clubs functioning all across the world. Nowadays, they actually do a lot of charity work and toy drives, but their colorful past remains vivid. Number 3. The Mongols. The Mongols are a lesser-known bike gang, kind of similar to the Hells Angels. They too were made in California, but a few years later than the Hells Angels in 1969. They were nothing more than a mainstream motorcycle club, their goal to simply hang out and have fun. Today, the Mongols are considered to be one of the most dangerous gangs still in operation in America. They went from a mainstream club full of normal guys to an army of violent bikers in about 15 years. Today, most of the Mongols' 2,000 members are Hispanic males. Most of their favorite pastimes is racially motivated violence. They've become known to lash out at African American civilians and gang members indiscriminately. It was the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms that named them the most violent gang in America. This is in part because of the gang war they fought with the Hells Angels in the 1980s, gaining control of Southern California despite being tiny compared to the larger gang. They won the turf war by sheer force of will and unbridled cruelty. Number 2. Simon City Royals. The Simon City Royals were formed in 1952, making them one of the oldest gangs in continual operation anywhere in the U.S. They're also one of the largest predominantly white gangs involved in the country. In the 1960s, they were heavily involved with drug smuggling and racketeering, and were often involved in turf wars with other local gangs like the Latin Kings and the Imperial Gangsters. The Simon City Gang battled a gang called the Royals and lost, forcing the two gangs to merge together, becoming the Simon City Royals. The gang wars went on and on, like really on and on without end, until the 1990s when things finally started to calm down. It was always over turf and drug distribution. Today, the Simon City Royals still have a heavy presence in the prison system and still control parts of the Chicago North Side. They're also in Wisconsin and Mississippi. Number 1. The Black Spades. The Black Spades is a gang that started off in the Bronx in the late part of the 1960s and became wildly popular in the 1970s. The gang officially formed at a junior high school. They were just a bunch of kids influenced by groups like the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam. In the beginning, they wanted to organize a fight against racism and bigotry. They policed their local neighborhoods to protect against the incoming scourge of drug dealers and drug addicts slowly taking over the community. There was even a chapter of Black Spades that was entirely female. Unfortunately, the Black Spades became too popular for their own good and started losing focus. The younger members became violent. They devolved into a criminal street gang peddling drugs, and they just kind of disintegrated. Amazingly, the Black Spades made a comeback in 2019 after changing their name to the Black Spades New Direction and becoming a community service program, offering food distribution to the less fortunate and championing anti-violence.
Number 10. 17 stories. A woman in Russia has died trying to do some hardcore parkour. She was only 24 years old when she fell down 17 stories to her death. It happened as she was trying to jump from the top of one building to the other and missed. According to St. Petersburg police, she went to the top of the building with her sister and found 4 local men. The men were experienced parkour experts, but all the expertise in the world didn't protect the young woman's brains from bursting open on the sidewalk below. To understand just exactly how this young girl fell to her death, we need to take a look at the roofs she was jumping between. One of them, the starting point, was quite a bit taller than the other building. She was supposed to run to the edge and then jump, gauging how far to go based on the gap between the buildings. But because she may not have had enough experience, she misjudged the gap between the rooftops. She ended up missing the lower rooftop by a pretty large margin. The result was the same as jumping off the edge of a cliff. She hit the concrete below and was dead. And to make matters worse, the men fled the scene. Number 9. Pavel's backflip. Pavel Koshin was trying to do a backflip when he died. It's really as simple as that. The guy lost his footing, he happened to be on the edge of a 16-floor building, and then he was gone. Pavel was known to his town for being a parkour daredevil. Just like the young girl that died trying to jump between buildings, Pavel was also from St. Petersburg. But Pavel's death happened way earlier, nearly a decade ago in 2013. He was performing stunts on the rooftop of an old Soviet-style building while his friends filmed his flips and tricks, and for some reason, there's actually a photograph still floating around online of the very second before Pavel's backflip went very wrong. In the world of freerunners, it was a huge tragedy, primarily because Pavel was known as one of the best. He did breakthrough stunts, he had some of the most impressive moves, and his videos took the internet by storm. His sudden death showed just how dangerous parkour can be. He had done thousands of flips before, but losing his footing when he came down from that final backflip had him slipping sideways off the roof. He plummeted headfirst like a sack of potatoes onto the pavement below. Number 8. Parkour for kids. 21 children were injured in San Diego at a parkour gym for kids. According to San Diego Fire Rescue, a stairway collapsed at the gym, resulting in complete mayhem. There were at least 50 children attending the nighttime parkour lesson. The platform that collapsed was a wooden deck about 30 feet long. The kids had been running across the deck to reach the upper level of the facility, where there was pizza waiting for them. The stairwell collapsed without any notice. At least 4 of the victims may have suffered from irreversible spine injuries. The results of the kids were in a very rough shape. It was a total disaster, with nearly half the children in attendance being taken away to the hospital. But the kids weren't the only ones who got injured. 2 adults were also hurt in the freak accident. If you're wondering how such an accident could have happened, it was because the platform couldn't hold the weight of all those children. It was an obvious breach of safety that may have caused 4 kids to break their spines. After all this destruction, the child's parkour gym is likely going to be out of business. Number 7. The Little Daredevil. At 13 years old, a youngster known only by his first name, Tolya, was something of a little daredevil. He was obsessed with parkour and impressing his friends. After all, what 13-year-old kid doesn't live life on the edge in hopes of being cool? Sadly for Tolya, while showing off one day for his buddies, he slipped and fell 100 feet to the ground below. At the time, he had been dangling by nothing but his fingertips from the 9th floor of an abandoned tower block. His fingers slipped. He desperately tried to hold on, but it was too late. One of the old bricks broke loose, and like the bad guy's death at the end of an action movie, Tolya went flailing through the air. His friends heard the thump of his body hitting the ground and ran to get help. According to what one of the kid's friends told reporters, he was in shock when he saw the body. He was so shocked when he saw the kid's mutilated remains that he just sat there for 30 minutes not knowing what to do. And that's the truth about what happens when a person falls that far. Their body breaks, and it's truly an ugly scene. What's the craziest thing you ever did to impress your friends when you were a teenager? Whatever you did it almost kill you? Let us know how big of a daredevil you were in the comments below. And if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe button if you haven't already. Number 6. Saved by the current. In Russia, yet again, a guy trying to do parkour ended up having a disaster. But unlike most parkour disasters, this one ended without anybody dying. The professional parkour maniac, a guy named Sergei Shurikov, was jumping from rooftop to rooftop. As he was doing it, he had a camera clamped to his mouth to capture all the action. This is like a cheap Russian alternative to a simple GoPro attached to a helmet. The day was going fine until he made his final jump. As he leaped off the ledge of the roof, 25 floors above the ground, he made a mistake. He misjudged the distance he was supposed to jump and fell, catching himself just before all was lost on some hanging electric wires. If he hadn't reached out and grabbed those wires, his face would have hit the brick side of the building and the back of his head would have bounced off the concrete below. But miraculously, he grabbed the wires. Yes, they sent a severe electric shock through his body, but he held on nonetheless and pulled himself up to safety. According to what Sergey told his viewers when uploading the terrifying video of his near-death experience, he had already been doing parkour for 13 years. This goes to show that even real pros can misjudge distance and fall to their death. Number 5. Johnny Turner. Johnny Turner was 28 years old when he died from a parkour accident. Johnny was famous for traveling all across Europe to practice parkour and doing free running. He was described by friends as a pioneer to the British urban exploration community. He scaled all kinds of buildings throughout UK, such as the Battersea Power Station. He was also a fan of free running through abandoned structures, but Johnny was more than just a free runner. He was a person. According to James Wood, a fellow parkour expert, Johnny was thoughtful, gentle, and one of the most positive people you'd ever meet. It's no wonder everybody was heartbroken when Johnny tumbled off some scaffolding, fell down 8 stories, and snapped his neck on the ground. The authorities were a little stingy with the exact details, but we do know Johnny had been practicing parkour at a block of apartments in Waterloo. We also know that he had been doing it at nighttime. Perhaps it was too dark. Whatever the case, he missed his step, flung himself off the scaffolding, splattered to the ground. Number 4. A bad shortcut. In India, a student trying to do a bit of parkour to save himself some time ended up dead. The kid was just 19 years old, identified as Sikaran. He fell from the 3rd floor of a hostel while trying to leap onto the balcony of the adjacent hospital. If you're confused, let me break it down for you. In India, lots of students live in hostels. It's quite popular in other places around the world as a cheap living alternative. It's the equivalent of American students staying in student housing. Because one hostel was directly beside another, many of the students simply did parkour to travel between them. Instead of going all the way from the 3rd floor to the ground floor, entering through the front door, and climbing back up 3 stories, people just jumped from balcony to balcony. It was a Tuesday night when the shortcut proved deadly for Sikaran. As he tried to cross over the other balcony, a gap of only 3 feet, he slipped and fell between the 2 buildings. He cracked his skull and splintered his ribs, later dying at the hospital. To make matters even more disturbing, surveillance footage caught every second of the terrifying incident. Before he made the jump to the other balcony and missed, other students can be seen coercing him into doing it. They were beyond shocked when he slipped and fell all the way down to the bottom. Number 3. 11 floors down. In Spain, yet another teenager has died doing parkour. This teen was 17 years old, and he fell 11 floors until he smacked his body to the ground and died. He had been climbing inside a construction site. According to the national police who were involved in the investigation, he and some friends were on Holy Guardian Angel Avenue, attempting risky jumps as they climbed higher and higher up the construction site. They were running, vaulting, rolling, and all other verbs included with parkour. But alas, there was one jump that the kid just couldn't make. When he missed, that was the end of him. Paramedics did arrive almost immediately after the accident was reported, but they could do nothing to save the boy's life. The paramedics said that he died immediately upon impact. And that does make sense, seeing as he fell 11 floors. The force of the impact pretty much shot his brains out the back of his skull. He may as well have jumped out of an airplane without a parachute. Number 2. From the top. In China, an expert in parkour fell from the top of a skyscraper like an ant falling out the side of your house. His name was Wu Yongning, and he was known in China for being one of the most courageous daredevils around. He was famous for climbing very tall buildings and taking risky pictures. These pictures were usually of him clinging onto the side of something for dear life. He also happened to be a trained professional, skilled in martial arts, with a background as a stuntman in films. At the time of his death, Wu was trying to earn enough money to fund his wedding and to treat his sick mother. According to what Wu's step-uncle told the Beijing News, Wu was planning to propose to his girlfriend the day after he filmed himself doing parkour 62 stories up at the top of the skyscraper. He was going to take the money he earned from the risky pictures, get married, save his mom's life, and be a real hero. Sadly, it didn't go that way at all. As he clung to the side of the building, not secured by any kind of safety harness, he fell. The maniac was trying to do pull-ups over 60 stories up, and he lost his grip. The 26-year-old plummeted all the way to the ground, luckily not to fall directly on someone's head. He died immediately and never got to propose to his girlfriend. And number 1, New Year's Day. On New Year's Day in Paris, a 17-year-old parkour enthusiast named Nye Newman met his end. It happened below the city, on the Paris metro. Nye came to Paris from England for vacation with his girlfriend. For the previous few years, he had been extremely into parkour, climbing over obstacles and jumping from building to building. He was actually something of an internet sensation and an inspiration to many people. This was because of his positive outlook and enthusiastic lifestyle. In 2016, he did parkour in Hong Kong. He posted photos on his social media of leaping between buildings, even doing tricks at the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland. But it would be the Paris metro that finally put the young man's career to bed. And to make matters even worse, Nye brought the accident upon himself. According to the most recent report from the BBC, Nye Newman died when he stuck his head out of the train to take a selfie and hit his head. He and his girlfriend were heading to the Eiffel Tower to see the fireworks for New Year's Eve. While on the train, Nye climbed between 2 carriages, poked his head out to take a picture, and was struck by an unknown object. There is definitely a reason why you don't stick your head out of a moving train, especially one that's underground. It could have been a pipe, a piece of debris, no one knows. But whatever it was, it hit Nye in the head so hard that he was dead immediately.
Number 10. Killer Clown. A crazy person with their face tattooed to look like a clown killed their cellmate in California. But the killer clown didn't just murder the inmate with whom they shared the prison cell. He tortured them. It's not exactly clear how they managed to get away with this in a secure prison, but it happened nonetheless. Jamie Osuna severed his cellmate's spine, scooped out his eyes with his bare hands, and sliced open his mouth with a makeshift razor blade so that he looked like a sick caricature of Batman's Joker. The victim in this situation was 44-year-old Louis Romero. Prison guards found him mutilated in a cell that he shared with Jamie on March 9th in the Corcoran State Prison. According to prison officials, Romero had been conscious for a significant portion of the time that he was being cut up. One of the victim's fingers was cut off. He was mutilated beyond repair, and the very last insult was for the killer clown to decapitate him. To date, this is one of the most gruesome prison murders ever, and it was committed by a guy who had his face tattooed to look like an insane clown. Number 9. Las Vegas Nazi. In Las Vegas, a man covered in terrifying Nazi tattoos killed a 75-year-old woman in her home. It happened back in 2013, though the Nazi was only recently sentenced to spend 44 years locked up. During the court proceedings, Basil Morgan was 26. 2 years earlier, he broke into the house of Jean Main with the intention of burglarizing her. Jean was alone in her house. There was no one there to defend her, and Morgan used this to his advantage. He hit her over the head so hard with his pistol that the trigger guard fractured into pieces. And as if beating her with the pistol wasn't enough, he shot her in the back of the head, execution style. When the woman's boyfriend came home, he discovered her face down in the bathroom, already dead. Morgan escaped the house with a suitcase full of items that he stole from the dead woman, then fled the scene with his getaway driver. The getaway driver was Keith Smith, who was sentenced to between 4 and 10 years for his participation in the burglary. But let's go back to this guy's face tattoos for a minute. Morgan has spent his entire life as a ward of the state. As a young child, he was either under the protection of Child Protective Services or locked in a jail cell. As he grew older, he became more and more radicalized. As of now, he has some pretty horrendous tattoos on his face, including a swastika under his left eye, the words "Baby Nazi" on his neck, and a pair of white supremacist tattoos right over his eyebrows. Number 8. Snack Shack Attack. In Oregon, a man was facing multiple charges after he fled from police and went into a grocery store. It happened in Portland, with the first responders being transit police officers. They had received a phone call about a man who broke into the snack shack. He ran away when he saw the officers coming. They chased him. He went into the grocery store, and then he cornered himself in the back stockroom. There was only one way in and one way out. But when the officers tried to take this individual into custody, he put his hands under his jacket and said he was going to shoot them if they didn't get out of his way. Luckily, the officers called his bluff. he didn't have a weapon at all. They got him into custody and locked him up in the Multnomah County Detention Center. He was identified as Matthew Joseph Medlin, and it wasn't his first time having a run-in with the law. In 2014, he was taken into custody after he escaped from prison, which he had initially been in for sexual abuse, assault, and burglary. And once he got out in 2016, he was arrested yet again when police found him living in a dumpster. A few months later, he was arrested another time for trying to bite a police officer and for licking a man's face. What the heck? Speaking of faces, this guy has a terrifying facial tattoo. He's not the kind of guy that officers can forget. He's also not the kind of person that would ever be able to evade the police. He has what look like bat wings tattooed over his eyebrows, along with a bunch of other strange ink that nobody can make much sense of. Much of his face is tattooed in shades of red and purple, and he even has a purple mohawk. It's a wonder he ever escaped from jail in the first place. Number 7. The I-5 Strangler. A serial killer from California, known locally as the I-5 Strangler, was murdered in his prison cell by another convicted killer with 666 tattooed on his face. Between 1977 and 1987, Roger Kibb went on a murderous rampage. This was back when murderers didn't have face tattoos and could blend in with everybody else. He was finally caught and convicted, charged with the killings of at least 7 different women and girls. Naturally, he got life in prison. Roger was 81 years old when karma finally caught up with him in its truest form. He was discovered unconscious in his cell at the Mule Creek State Prison. After they took him to the medical center, he quickly passed away. As it turned out, his inmate, convicted killer Jason Boudreaux, was the one behind the homicide. Jason was in prison for second-degree murder, from strangling his girlfriend to death in 2011. Well, the girlfriend wouldn't be Jason at last. He also strangled the I-5 Strangler to death in a bizarre case of irony. When asked why he strangled the Strangler, Jason said it started as a sneaky plan to get his cell back so that he had more privacy. But by the time the killing was done, Jason said he felt happy to have avenged all those girls that the I-5 Strangler murdered over 30 years ago. The man with the 666 tattoo on his face gave those girls the justice system never could. The only question now is who will give justice to the girlfriend Jason strangled to get into prison in the first place. Number 6. Guilty Inc. William Bottoms Jr. was found guilty of the double murders in 2017 of Dedrick Dwayne Williams and Mohammed Seed Hussein. But before the case even went to court, his lawyers feared that the jury would condemn him regardless of his innocence, based purely on his face. The reason for this is that William is covered in weird tattoos, from the top of his bald head down to his neck. None of them are particularly offensive, but the fact that his entire face is covered in ink really worried the lawyers. To put it lightly, he looks like the kind of guy that would stab you and rob you in a dark alley at night. In the end, William was probably guilty of the murders anyway. He had spent most of his life in and out of prison, usually for petty crimes, but this time he committed grisly slayings. He became paranoid while taking too many drugs in June of 2017 and gunned down the 2 victims without mercy, even though his lawyers tried to explain to the jury that he was a, and I quote, good dude. That didn't change the evidence. He had definitely done the killings, so it didn't matter that he had devil horns tattooed on his face. He is a killer, with or without the ink. Do you think William would have had a better chance in court had he not had his face tattooed? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 5. Charlie Manson's ashes. A man with a sick obsession with Charles Manson has gotten himself a tattoo with the dead cult leader's ashes. How exactly this happened is a long and very confusing story. We should start with Charles Manson, the maniac leader of the Manson family cult that killed 7 people in the 1960s, including the famous actress Sharon Tate. Manson was in jail until the day he died in 2017, at the age of 83. He spent almost his entire life behind bars, though his actual sentence was 9 consecutive life terms. Technically, Manson needs to resurrect himself and serve his other 8 terms. Now for the guy with the tattoo. His name is Patrick Booz. He's not a criminal, but he is about as big of an outsider as a person can get. He has an X tattooed in the center of his forehead, like Charles Manson, and he has the term Helter Skelter tattooed above his right eye. He's an unusual-looking man with unusual interests. According to what he told Vice, his most recent tattoo was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the infamous killer Charles Manson a literal part of him. When Manson died, there was a legal battle to see who would claim his body. One of his grandsons, Jason Freeman, ultimately won the battle and took possession of the corpse. He cremated Manson and kept the ashes. Tattooist Ryan Gillikin claims that he procured a small pinch of the ashes through a friend of Manson's grandson. He then took those ashes and gave Patrick Booz 2 tattoos he had always been craving. For just $600, Patrick received the X tattoo and the Helter Skelter tattoo, both on his face, using ink mixed with the ashes of Charles Manson. Number 4. Skullface. A fugitive with his face tattooed to look like a skull managed to hide for nearly a month after he escaped prison. His name is Corey Hughes, 27 years old. He was arrested in California almost 30 days after he walked off a work crew and vanished. Well, he didn't walk away. He ran for dear life, managing to avoid the police officers and disappear for weeks. It's unclear how he managed to stay hidden, considering his face literally looks like a skull. It's covered in black and gray ink to make it look as though he's a skeleton. The only reason the police apprehended this guy at all is that they received a tip that Corey Hughes was hiding at a residence in Stockton. The cops banged on the door. Nobody answered, and so they released a canine unit. The dogs were quick to discover Corey. The cops took him back to jail, and that was it for the man with the skull face. The sheriff's office even wrote on the Facebook page, "Escapee Corey Hughes is home for the holidays." And by home, they meant the San Joaquin County Jail. Number 3. Murder. In northern Colorado, a 19-year-old named Leonardo Biarato confessed to the brutal shooting of Edward Joseph Boyle Jr. He was sentenced to 32 years in prison for the murder, which happened back in 2018. When arrested, Leonardo had a sort of confession freshly tattooed over his left eyebrow. It was a single word: murder. And while this obviously doesn't count as a real confession, it was pretty obvious that he had gotten the tattoo as a sort of tribute to the murder he had just committed. What a guy. What's really crazy is that it took the police 5 months to arrest Leonardo for his crime. This is despite the fact that witnesses heard the 2 men fighting, heard a gunshot, and then Boyle was discovered dead. The tattooed murderer went on the run and managed to evade the authorities for nearly half a year before they caught him and put him away for good. Number 2. Demon Woman. In South Carolina, a woman's mugshot went viral in 2017 for her completely black eyeballs. Morgan Joyce Barr, just 24 years old, was arrested after she invited a strange man into her home and then robbed him at gunpoint. This is according to the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office. She was charged with armed robbery, malicious injury, and kidnapping. Take one look at her. You can tell she's had a pretty rough life. Her black eyeballs just make that much worse. According to every single person who's seen the mugshots, she looks like a demon woman. However, the police never did come forward and say whether her eyes were the results of tattoos directly on her eyeballs, or if she had simply been wearing contact lenses. In any case, she's very scary looking. Number 1. The Man Baby. 29-year-old Corey P. Smits has the worst tattoos on his face. But it's not just his ugly facial tattoos that make Corey interesting. It's the fact that he looks both like a 50-year-old man and a baby at the same time. He seems to be missing a lot of his hair, but it's hard to tell if that's because it hasn't grown in yet or because it's already fallen out. He's also been arrested multiple times for drinking and driving. His most recent offense saw him 3 times over the legal limit. It was the 5th time he got a DUI in Two Rivers, Wisconsin. It makes you wonder how he is still able to drive. It's honestly not even clear what his face tattoos are. He has dots along his eyebrows and what appear to be alligators over those, but we could be mistaken. According to court documents, Corey's 5th DUI saw him put on probation. He was also ordered to undergo intoxicated driver assessment, to submit random urine tests, to spend 10 months in jail, and to pay nearly $4,000 in fines. But seeing as this was the baby man's 5th offense, he's probably just going to do it again anyway. Which of these tattoos do you think is just the worst? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't be shy. Remember to hit subscribe if you liked the video, and come back soon for more awesome content from the channel. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.